One quiet morning, Jake Mitchell's peaceful farm life shattered with a single knock on his front door. Standing on the porch was Karen Whitmore, self-appointed queen of a nearby homeowners association, clad in a flawless beige blazer, clipboard clutched to her chest, and a list of demands on her lips. Repaint your barn, silence that rooster, or else. For Jake, that was the moment everything changed. His family's legacy, sprawling farmland passed down through generations, didn't deserve to be trampled by a suburban dictator. Karen had declared war, and it was game on. Jake's farm was no ordinary piece of land. It was memory and heritage etched into every weathered fence post, every patch of soil, and every scrap of red paint on that old barn. His grandfather had taught him to plow these fields. His mother had once sung lullabies on the porch during harvest season, and every sunrise reminded him just how precious this inheritance was. The smell of fresh earth in the morning, the distant sound of roosters crowing, and the serene rustle of tall grass were all Jake needed to feel at peace. The last thing he wanted was an outsider barging in with rules meant for a cookie-cutter suburb. But that morning, Karen made it clear, rules were all she cared about. She introduced herself with an air of manufactured politeness, sounding like a door-to-door salesperson who assumed a well-honed pitch would corner him into submission. Jake, still nursing his cup of coffee, kept his tone as neutral as possible, even though he already sensed trouble. Karen's opening lines dripped with condescension. "We've received multiple complaints from the Crestwood Estates community about the unsightly nature of your barn. Red paint can be so jarring. And that rooster of yours is disturbing some of our residents at dawn. We have strict guidelines to protect property values, you see." Jake was no stranger to difficult personalities. He owned goats, stubborn mules, and even that cantankerous old rooster who pecked at every available ankle. But Karen was a breed of her own, perched atop her HOA throne as if every inch of land belonged under her domain. He simply shrugged. "Ma'am, I'm not part of your HOA. My farm's been here longer than that neighborhood's even existed." Karen's smile grew tighter, and the silent standoff began. She delivered thinly veiled threats about future complications if he didn't comply, but Jake just sipped his coffee unconcerned. By sundown, an official-looking letter appeared in his mailbox, stamped with the Crestwood Estates logo. It cited a list of so-called violations. The barn's color clashed with community standards, the rooster was too noisy, and the presence of livestock was culturally inconsistent with the suburban environment. Reading it nearly made Jake laugh out loud. He wasn't part of their association. He owed them nothing. Shaking his head, he stuck the letter onto his fridge like a war trophy and tried to move on with his life. Maybe, he reasoned, if he ignored it, they'd get bored. After all, what more could they do? Unfortunately, Karen was just getting started. Over the next week, a swarm of inspectors, health department, zoning commission, even an animal welfare officer descended on his property. They arrived armed with clipboards and cautious expressions, only to leave baffled when they found nothing amiss. One inspector, a weary man named Roger, even apologized. "I keep being told there's some big code violation here, but your farm's spotless. Look, son, I don't know who you made mad, but they've got us running in circles." Jake knew exactly who was behind it, Karen. She'd weaponized every possible authority just to rattle him. Soon, more letters materialized in his mailbox, this time handwritten in different names, but obviously penned by the same petty hand. They complained about smells, about children being traumatized by the sight of barn animals, about the supposed plummet of property values. It was almost comical, but the relentlessness was annoying. Karen wasn't just waging war, she was in full siege mode. Jake held his composure until the day he heard a chainsaw roaring at the property boundary. Dropping his tools, he rushed toward the racket. There stood Karen, supervising a crew of workers erecting a hideous steel barrier. She was cutting right through his property line, looking smug as they dug into the soil. "This fence," she proclaimed, "is a community improvement project. Your farm detracts from Crestwood Estates aesthetics, so we're installing a barrier to protect our idyllic view." Jake's blood boiled. She was literally fencing off his land without his permission or any legal claim. He confronted the workers who admitted the HOA had told them they had permission. Jake shot them a hard glare. "Unless you have my signature or a county approval, you're trespassing. Pack up, or the sheriff will be here to do it for you." They didn't need the sheriff's involvement to see the writing on the wall. The moment Jake pulled out his phone, the crew scrambled to haul away their equipment. Karen's expression was priceless. Shock, fury, and a flash of panic all at once. She ranted that the property lines were wrong, that old survey maps favored the HOA, and that Jake was making life difficult for everyone. He just smirked and dialed the local sheriff's number, watching Karen's face go pale. Before he even finished the call, she was gone, trailing indignation in her wake. That very night, Jake dug out his official property deed and survey maps, then fired off a cease and desist letter to the HOA. He made extra copies for good measure. If Karen thought she could scare him, she was about to learn how prepared a farmer could be, and how stubborn. But Karen wasn't finished. The next escalation was more brazen. Jake woke up one morning to find a for sale sign planted near the road, practically on his driveway. Underneath it, another sign read, "Under negotiation, coming soon to Crestwood Estates." For a moment, he just stared in disbelief. Did they honestly think staking a real estate sign on his property would make him pack up and leave? Jake ripped the sign out of the ground, marched straight up to the house, and prepared to call the HOA office. Right on cue, Karen arrived, feigning surprise. "Oh, that must be a miscommunication with the real estate folks," she said, voice dripping with false innocence. Jake let her ramble for 10 seconds before cutting her off. "Look, I'm not stupid. Don't plant another sign here. This land isn't for sale." To drive the point home, Jake expanded his farm's presence rather than shrink it. Karen wanted the rooster gone. He bought 3 more, each one with a penchant for a 5 a.m. wake-up call. She wanted the land to look less rustic. He planted a whole stretch of towering sunflowers along the property line, forming a bright golden barrier that forced anyone in Crestwood Estates to behold the vibrant spectacle every morning. The pettiness was deliberate, and it worked. Neighbors complained anew about the unsightly glare of yellow flowers. It was exactly the kind of complaint Jake relished. Meanwhile, he strengthened alliances. He paid a visit to the county records office, retrieving duplicates of every relevant document: land deeds, zoning documents, older survey maps, anything to shut down Karen's claims. He also dropped by the sheriff's station for a chat. Sheriff Tom Caldwell was an old family friend who'd known Jake since he was a kid. When Jake explained the never-ending harassment and even the fence incident, Tom shook his head in exasperation. "They don't have a legal leg to stand on. She steps a toe over that boundary again, you let me know." But Jake's best weapon wasn't just legal documents or sheriff protection. It was community favor. The moment folks in town got wind of the ridiculous HOA feud, interest skyrocketed. A local friend, Mason, managed the town's farmers market and hatched an ingenious plan: host a weekly event on Jake's land. Let the public come and see for themselves how harmless the farm really was. That weekend, bright flyers popped up around town announcing family fun on Mitchell Farms, fresh produce, petting zoo, live country music. The event was a smash hit. Kids played with baby goats. Parents stocked up on vegetables and eggs. Local musicians set up near the wide barn doors, and the laughter carried all the way into Crestwood Estates. Karen hated every second. She showed up mid-event, outraged by the parking situation. Cars were lined along the public road, near the property boundary. Her shrill voice cut through the music. "You can't do this. It's disruptive to the neighborhood." Jake calmly pointed out the county zoning laws that allowed agritourism, raising an eyebrow when she tried to argue otherwise. She left, sputtering threats about bringing it up with the board. Some days later, Jake noticed a strange car parked near the boundary. At first, he shrugged, but then he spotted a drone buzzing in the air. Figuring it was another prying tactic, he hopped on his ATV and drove closer. Sure enough, a man with a camera stood there, eyes darting guiltily. He claimed to be gathering evidence for a property dispute. Jake didn't buy it for a second. Likely another move in Karen's arsenal. When he demanded the man leave, the so-called investigator hurried away, but not before snapping a few final pictures. Perhaps that would have been the end of the nuisance, except an even more ridiculous HOA letter reached Jake the next day. It accused him of running unsanitary animal conditions and housing an unauthorized petting zoo. He laughed as he read it. Karen was piling on anything she could think of. That was when Jake decided enough was enough. He had a lawyer draw up a formal cease and desist, detailing all the trespasses and false accusations. Then, in his boldest move yet, he took that letter directly to the next HOA board meeting. Crestwood Estates held monthly gatherings in a modestly sized community center, and by the time Jake walked in, the room was already buzzing. Karen stood near the front table, delivering some sermon on community standards. The moment Jake stepped inside, an uneasy hush descended. After all, he wasn't a resident. He had no official reason to be there, but he didn't care. Striding right up to the board, He dropped the thick packet of legal papers onto a table. Addressing the group clearly so all could hear, "This is a cease and desist citing harassment, defamation, and illegal surveillance. I have footage of someone you hired snooping on my property. If this doesn't stop, I will sue the HOA and you, Karen, personally." Karen went pale. A few HOA members began flipping through the documents in alarm, and the murmuring in the room swelled. An older man, Richard, who was apparently the HOA president, cleared his throat. "Let's remain calm," he said, though his eyes betrayed concern. Karen tried to protest, calling Jake's accusations baseless, but he merely smirked and laid out the facts. "I have official property deeds, county zoning confirmations, countless examples of bogus complaints, not to mention the trespassing by your fence crew and that for sale sign fiasco. If you want to keep pushing, so will I. Your call." Silence thickened the air. Finally, Richard admitted, "Karen, maybe we've gone too far. Mr. Mitchell's land isn't actually under our jurisdiction." Karen's face twisted with fury, but the board's attitude had drastically shifted. Members who had once been mere silent supporters or fearful sycophants saw the writing on the wall. Continuing to harass Jake meant real legal trouble. That singular meeting was the turning point. People like Linda, a middle-aged homeowner who'd once been on the board, came forward to share how Karen had bullied them inside the community. Residents started telling stories about receiving fines for trivial infractions, mailboxes an inch too high, or kids' chalk on the sidewalk. The tide turned swiftly against Karen as more attendees realized they could finally speak up. In the following weeks, Jake discovered he had allies even within the HOA. Folks brought him internal emails, courtesy of a man named Greg, a retired veteran who was fed up. Those emails proved Karen had been faking residents' complaints with phony names. She'd also tried to pass a special assessment, essentially an extra fee, for legal funds to go after Jake. The board, now fully aware of her methods, was outraged. Suddenly there was talk of removing her from office altogether. Even the local paper got wind of the drama, running a front-page story titled, "The Farmer and the HOA, a Showdown in Crestwood Estates." Social media buzzed with opinions, many cheering on Jake for standing up to a controlling HOA. Some ridiculed suburban pettiness, while others applauded the comedic side of a once powerful enforcer undone by a single farmer. Though Karen's influence was waning, she made one last, desperate attempt to assert control. A day came when Jake discovered newly posted signs along the public roads leading to his farm. They read "Private Community, No Unauthorized Entry." Had the HOA actually tried to claim the county road as their own? This was next-level audacity. Jake made a few phone calls, and within hours a county official arrived in a county truck, absolutely livid. No, the HOA did not have the right to block public roads. And yes, the official wanted to meet whoever was responsible for such a stunt. Karen, sensing a final defeat, kept her head down. By the end of that day, the road was deemed public once more, and Karen received an official warning for illegal signage. That was the last straw for the majority of HOA board members, and an emergency meeting was called. As expected, Karen tried to spin the situation. "I was only protecting property values," she insisted, but the board wasn't having it. Richard, at the front of the room, calmly presented the evidence. "We have multiple complaints from Crestwood residents, plus legal threats from Mr. Mitchell. Karen, you acted without board approval on several occasions, which leaves us all open to a lawsuit we can't afford." Her usual stiff composure cracked. She threatened legal action of her own, tried to paint herself as the one true defender of the community, but she had no allies left. The board voted to remove her as an enforcement officer, and then to strip her of any official capacity. A hush spread when Richard said, "Karen, you might also consider moving out. This community can't heal under your leadership." That decisive vote spelled the end for Karen's reign. Within a day or two, a moving truck appeared in front of her house, and word spread that Karen was selling the property. Jake barely had to lift a neighbors who once feared her tyranny suddenly relaxed, free to enjoy simpler joys like grilling outside without worrying about receiving a fine for excess smoke. Kids could draw on sidewalks again, families could store bicycles without fear of an inspection, and the entire atmosphere of Crestwood Estates brightened. Jake saw the news when Linda and Greg dropped by with a fresh pie as thanks. "We wanted to apologize for all the trouble," Linda said quietly, setting the pie on Jake's porch table. "We never agreed with Karen's vendetta, we just didn't have the courage to cross her." Greg nodded. "You did what none of us could, took away her power." Jake smirked and offered them coffee. He bore no real grudge against the reasonable members. It was Karen's megalomania that had caused all the chaos. They chatted for a while, talking about plans to move forward. Linda admitted that once Karen left, the HOA would refocus on beneficial community projects, not frivolous power plays. And so, Karen was gone, forced out by her own destructive tactics. The day after her departure, Jake erected a sign at the edge of his property, right where passersby could see it. In bold letters it read, "Welcome to Mitchell Farms, HOA free since 1923. People loved it, snapping pictures to share on social media. The story of the farmer who toppled the HOA tyrant became part of local folklore. But Karen's story didn't end there. Rumors trickled back that in her new town she'd joined another HOA community and found herself on the receiving end of strict, unyielding covenant rules. She got fined for her grass height, for parking an inch over the line, for leaving her porch light on past a certain hour. The new neighborhood's enforcer was every bit as uncompromising and rigid as Karen had been. Within a month, stories circulated that Karen planned to move yet again, presumably searching for a place where she could be in charge. It was poetic justice. All the tactics she once inflicted on others came back around. Meanwhile, Mitchell Farms thrived. Jake expanded the weekly farmers event, turning it into a community cornerstone with live music, bonfires, fresh produce, and happy families, enjoying an authentic taste of farm life. Even some residents of Crestwood Estates, newly freed from Karen's iron grip, became loyal customers who dropped by each weekend to chat and buy local goods. The final comedic flourish was seeing the once hostile HOA board members praising Jake's chickens, goats, and even the noisy roosters for adding character to the area. Jake never saw Karen in person again after her humiliating exit, but every now and then, when he was out mending fences or sipping coffee on his wraparound porch at sunrise, his gaze would flick to that sign by the road. "Welcome to Mitchell Farms, HOA free since 1923. It made him smile, remembering how close he'd come to letting an outsider bully him off land that had stood in his family for generations. He couldn't help reflecting on the moral of it all. Some fights you don't walk away from. You dig in, stand tall, and do whatever it takes to protect what's yours. Because if there's one thing Karen Whitmore learned the hard way, it's that you don't bring a clipboard to a tractor fight and expect to win." Jake's victory also sent a message to the entire town. Old-fashioned grit and a sense of belonging can outlast any fancy suburban rulebook. By the time summer rolled around, the clash between Jake and Karen was no longer fresh gossip. It had already become part of local legend. People told the tale in barbershops, coffeehouses, and football bleachers, describing how the unstoppable force of HOA authority met the immovable object of family tradition. Everyone had their own spin on it, but the ending was always the same. Karen lost, Jake won, and Mitchell Farms stood strong. Even families who lived miles away from Crestwood Estates found satisfaction in the moral of the story. OAs could do good things, sure, like maintaining clean streets, organizing holiday decorations, and ensuring a baseline of order, but when power went to someone's head, watch out. Without Karen's oppressive oversight, Crestwood Estates mellowed into a laid-back suburban enclave. Minor disagreements got handled through conversation rather than heavy-handed fines. Parents let their kids run lemon stands or sell cookies without worrying about some random rule. Dogs barked occasionally, roosters crowed from a distance, and not a soul made a fuss. It was as if a quiet revolution had uprooted the paranoia of living under Karen's brand of tyranny. And Jake? He had even grander plans. Realizing how popular the local farm gatherings were, he teamed up with his friend Mason to organize a summer festival, complete with hay rides, local craft vendors, and live folk music. The entire county embraced the idea, stationed food trucks around the outer fields, and turned a corner of farmland into a joyous festival ground. When visitors asked if the HOA had any say in the event, Jake would just chuckle. "Nope, not this land. Never has, never will." Sometimes people teased him. "You should start your own association, Farmers Organized Against Ridiculous Tyranny, FOR for short." He'd laugh but politely decline. The last thing he wanted was more bureaucracies. His brand of neighborliness didn't come in the form of rules. It came from a handshake and a readiness to pitch in if someone needed help. Ironically, that sense of community was probably stronger than any rule. Word about Karen's downfall also reached the new families who'd moved into Crestwood Estates after everything settled. They'd drive past Jake's farm, noticing how lively and welcoming it was, sometimes stopping to buy produce or chat. Jake, never one to hold grudges, greeted them kindly, gave them tours of the barn, and let their kids feed the goats. Many times these newcomers were startled to learn that an infamous tug-of-war happened right here, where a woman once threatened to supplant farmland with endless rows of matchy-matchy suburban houses. They'd look around at the orchard, the sunflowers, the contented animals, and scratch their heads, saying, "Why would anyone want to pave over this?" As months passed and the seasons changed, Jake's routine on the farm stayed steady but fulfilling. He'd rise before dawn, feed the animals, check on the crops, and ensure each day's tasks aligned with the weather. There was grass to mow, eggs to collect, fences to mend, and produce to pick. Yet he loved every part of it. The rooster's crow, once a point of contention, was now music to his ears. Without Karen's grip, that crow was just another harmonic detail of the countryside, a reminder that farmland had its own rhythm. Suburbanites might find it loud or messy, but for Jake, it was a serenade of freedom. One afternoon, Linda visited once more, this time with a handful of old photographs she'd discovered while cleaning out the Crestwood Estates clubhouse. They showed the earliest days of the neighborhood's construction, featuring farmland rolling far into the distance. Linda suspected these pictures dated back a few decades, and she smiled as she laid them on Jake's porch table. "Not sure if any of this land used to belong to your family, but I bet it did." In many of the shots, the wide open fields were dotted with the same style of fencing that lined Jake's property. He felt a surge of pride. "Looks likely," he said, tracing a fence in the photo with a fingertip. Yet he loved every part of it. The rooster's crow, once a point of contention, was now music to his ears. Without Karen's grip, that crow was just another harmonic detail of the countryside, a reminder that farmland had its own rhythm. Suburbanites might find it loud or messy, but for Jake, it was a serenade of freedom. One afternoon, Linda visited once more, this time with a handful of old photographs she'd discovered while cleaning out the Crestwood Estates clubhouse. They showed the earliest days of the neighborhood's construction, featuring farmland rolling far into the distance. Linda suspected these pictures dated back a few decades, and she smiled as she laid them on Jake's porch table. "Not sure if any of this land used to belong to your family, but I bet it did." In many of the shots, the wide open fields were dotted with the same style of fencing that lined Jake's property. He felt a surge of pride. "Looks likely," he said, tracing a fence. Property values at Crestwood Estates hadn't tanked. If anything, they'd stabilized, partly because the area now had a unique attraction. It wasn't just another sterile suburb with cookie-cutter fences. It was a place next to a thriving, scenic farm. In the end, Karen's attempts to micromanage someone else's land were doomed from the start. Her approach, intimidation, and endless rule enforcement only worked as long as people feared her. Jake never did. She tried everything from nuisance complaints to fence building to forging property lines, but she underestimated how the law, common sense, and old-fashioned determination could align against her. Even her fellow HOA members, many of whom once trembled under her watchful eye, found empowerment once they realized she had no legitimate authority over farmland that predated Crestwood Estates by decades. Local businesses also took note. A diner known as Maggie's Cafe cheekily created 2 special menu items: the Karen Special, a bland chicken dish served with a side of plain toast, and the Jake's Farmer's Breakfast, a hearty spread with eggs, bacon, biscuits, and a small container of fresh honey. It became a running joke around town. Order the Karen Special when you want nothing but trouble. Go for Jake's when you're looking for a good time. That playful spirit reflected how the entire community saw the feud. On the one hand, it was a clash of personalities. On the other, it was a testament to small-town resilience. A few months after Karen's departure, Jake was closing up a successful harvest season. He'd just sold out of sweet corn at the weekly farmers' event, and families were walking happily back to their cars. The warm glow of sunset bathed the barn. Before heading inside, Jake paused to watch the horizon. He remembered the day Karen had first arrived, how she marched up to his porch, demanding changes. For a fleeting second, he almost felt grateful for her intrusion. It pushed him to grow the farm's community connections, leading to a bigger, better enterprise than ever before. Mason pulled up in his old truck, hopped out, and grinned. "Heard the festival next year's gonna be even bigger," he said, referring to the summer event they'd jointly planned. Jake nodded. "Figured we'd bring in a few more folks from out of town. Maybe do a square dance night, a barbecue stand, things like that. The farmland's not going anywhere, so we might as well share it." Mason patted him on the shoulder. "Hard to believe some people thought it was an eyesore. Look at everybody smiling." Families were indeed smiling. A toddler was shrieking with delight as she chased a wandering chicken, and her parents laughed at how eager the bird was to dart away. Another kid was licking an ice cream cone from a vendor cart. The older crowd chatted leisurely, enjoying the breeze. It was pure Americana, which had always been the essence of Jake's farm, warm, welcoming, full of life. Meanwhile, Karen's name had faded into a cautionary tale told at HOA gatherings. Be careful about overreaching, or you might end up like her. Rumor had it she'd moved again, trying to find a place with an HOA board she could dominate, but failing at every turn. She'd become the stuff of local myth, that woman who tried to annex farmland to match her vision of suburban perfection. Over time, people even turned the story into jokes or affectionate warnings, like telling new HOA presidents, "We don't want another Karen fiasco." By the time winter arrived, Jake was preparing the farm to weather the cold months. Blankets for the animals, heating systems in the barn, and plenty of feedstock. The roosters still crowed at sunrise, oblivious that they'd once been the center of a neighborhood controversy. Nature went on, unstoppable, and any time Jake looked out at his fields dusted in light snow, he felt grateful. He defended his legacy, something intangible and invaluable. The farm had survived storms, droughts, and now an overzealous HOA. He quietly hoped that wherever Karen was, she might have learned a lesson about respecting boundaries in communities that predate subdivisions. Sure, not every HOA is run by a tyrant, but in this corner of the world, that association had been hijacked by one woman's hunger for power. Once she was gone, things found a healthy balance. People in Crestwood Estates got to keep a baseline of rules, like ensuring the roads stayed clean and common areas remained maintained, while also recognizing that not everyone wanted to conform to a single mold. And if they ever forgot, they'd glance at the farmland next door, the iconic barn that refused to be repainted, the roosters that crowed on their own schedule, and the family legacy that won out against conformity. The final chapter in this long tug-of-war was, in many ways, anticlimactic. Karen was simply gone, and peace replaced turmoil. Sometimes the biggest victories are quiet. For Jake, the ultimate reward wasn't an official HOA apology or a court ruling in his favor, though he did frame the final apology letter the board sent him, placing it right next to Karen's earliest cease and desist fiasco on his fridge. The real reward was waking up to a farm that still belonged to his family, unchanged, free from meaningless restrictions. Every so often, a resident or two from the neighborhood would ask if they could hold a wedding or a family reunion on the farm, drawn by the scenic setting. Jake was happy to oblige, provided they helped keep the place clean. Word spread that the old Mitchell farm was the perfect spot for gatherings, celebrations, and year-round festivals. Jake let them use the space for small fees that went back into upkeep. In a twist of fate, the once dreaded farmland that Karen insisted hurt property values became one of Crestwood's biggest draws. The presence of a real farm, with genuine farm-to-table produce, offered a sense of authenticity that development brochures couldn't replicate. As for the sign he put up, HOA free since 1923, it grew into a local landmark. People would drive out just to snap pictures with it. Some thought it was hilarious, others found it inspiring, and a handful were simply curious about the local legend. When kids asked about it, their parents would grin and tell the abridged version. A city lady tried to boss the farm around. The farm won. That was all they needed to know. Time marched on. The farm turned green again each spring, the roosters kept crowing, and the goats wrestled playfully behind the old fence. Jake's routine settled back into a comfortable rhythm, yet he rarely forgot the significance of standing up for oneself. He'd had plenty of challenges in life: poor weather, unpredictable livestock, mechanical breakdowns, but Karen was the first person who'd tried to snatch away his autonomy by sheer willpower. He couldn't begrudge her ambition, but he absolutely refused to let her claims stand. In doing so, he proved that no external authority could steamroll centuries of family heritage, especially when that heritage was well documented, strongly rooted in law, and backed by local goodwill. Looking back, Karen's entrance into his life was like a roving storm, loud, blustering, tossing everything around for a spell. But storms pass. The farmland remains. These days, for better or worse, that entire feud is recounted in easy conversation. Remember when Karen tried to move the property line? Or remember that time she planted a for sale sign in his yard without permission? People shake their heads and laugh. Jake sees it as a reminder that some folks will try to force their worldview on others, but practical clarity always wins in the end. From Karen's special brand of suburban tyranny to the town's embrace of Jake's agritourism, the story is ultimately about community growth. Once Karen was gone, Crestwood Estates emerged more relaxed, more communal, and more neighborly. Jake's farm blossomed into a cultural fixture, bringing together people from different walks of life. The battle was stressful at times, but it also catalyzed connections that might never have formed otherwise. In a mild way, Karen's antagonism did the farm a favor. She put it on the map, spurring more foot traffic, more local press, and more reason to celebrate farmland in a rapidly suburbanizing world. If you drive by Mitchell Farms nowadays, you'll see families wandering among rows of sunflowers, kids giggling at goats, and clusters of neighbors chatting like old friends. If you come at the right time of year, you might catch a festival in full swing, with the sweet smell of barbecued corn drifting through the air. And you'll definitely see that sign, "Welcome to Mitchell Farms, HOA free since 1923. No matter what else changes, that sign's staying put. It's a testament to a simple truth. You can't bury a family's legacy under suburban rules, and you sure can't fence off a farmer's rights with a clipboard and a few phone calls. In essence, Karen picked the wrong farmer to mess with, and in losing that fight, she taught everyone around them a valuable lesson about boundaries, resilience, and good old-fashioned